Welcome back for Module 2 of Hawaii Literacy's Adult Literacy Program Tutor Training. In this module, we will be discussing learning modalities and multiple intelligences. We will be referencing the following pages of your resources during this module. Take a moment and ask yourself, what comes to mind when you think about adults as learners? You can answer the sentence in your head, or you can jot something down. When considering adult learners, here are some things that come to mind for us. Adult learners are brave. Learning something new at any time in your life can be challenging, but asking for help and taking on the challenge of learning to read later in life takes a lot of bravery and courage. Adult learners are busy. As adults, we know how difficult it is to balance all the different aspects of our lives. Adding another thing to an already full plate is hard. Adult learners are talented in other areas. We can pull from these strengths in order to make our lessons engaging and connect personally with our learner. Adult learners have a wealth of life experiences. Competencies in other areas beyond reading can provide context for adult learning. Adult learners are motivated by tangible and practical goals. Adult learners are motivated by their real-world goals in learning literacy, so connecting what we are learning to those goals will help them be more successful. Keeping those goals in mind can orient our lessons and keep our learners interested and coming back to sessions. There are many different intelligences and competencies which are interrelated to us as human beings. Some adults might be very active but bad at math. Other adults are talented gardeners or singers but struggle with interpersonal skills. Realizing that there are many forms of intelligence and competencies can help us integrate our learners' strengths and interests into our lessons. You can view this graphic in more detail in your manual. Consider this clip from a TED Talk about how we store information in terms of meaning, and how the different ways that material is presented and experienced can add to our overall understanding and ability to learn and retain knowledge.
There's actually a few different versions, actually many different versions of learning styles, but probably the most common ones, the one that you've heard of, is that some of us are auditory learners, where we learn best by listening to things, and that some of us are more visual learners, where we learn best by seeing things, and that some of us might be more tactile or kinesthetic learners, where we learn best by actually doing things or engaging in physical activities. How many of you have heard of that before? Well, the good news and bad news. Bad news is, if you believe in learning styles, you're actually wrong. And I'll explain that in just a minute. But the good news is that it's not entirely your fault. This belief in learning styles is incredibly pervasive. It's so common that few people ever think to even question it, right? It sounds so logical. It sounds so real. But when put to the test, we found that learning styles don't exist. And again, there are tons of people that believe this. When we survey, for example, students and teachers, we find that something like 90% of them, or over 90% of people, believe that they have a learning style. And teachers today, many teachers are still told that part of their job, in order to be effective teachers, is to figure out what their students' learning styles are and then to accommodate them for the classroom. There are even a host of companies and organizations out there that support learning styles and who, for a fee, will train you on how to maximize your potential, or that of your students, right, by addressing learning styles and learning what yours are. But again, the key is, when put to the test, these learning styles don't exist, and it doesn't make a difference. Now, I will say that when we survey people, many people say they have preferences. So if I asked you, how would you like to learn something, or how would you like to study? Many of you might say things like, oh, I'd prefer to see it, or I'd prefer to hear it, or I'd prefer to actually do it. So that's true. But the key is that those preferences don't actually enhance your learning when we test them in experimental conditions. And there are many different ways to test this, but the basic design is this. We bring in a bunch of different people who have supposedly different learning styles. We teach them in a variety of ways, right? And then we see if teaching them in one way somehow was better for them or more effective than others. So for example, let's say I had a list of words that I wanted you to memorize, right? In one group, I might show you that list of words. I would present the list of words to you. Or in another group, similarly, I might actually show you images of those words. In yet another group or another condition, I might just let you listen to those words and hear them. So you wouldn't actually see anything, but you would just hear someone saying dog, hose, coat, etc. Now, if learning styles existed, if it was true, we would expect that visual learners or so-called visual learners would be able to recall more words when they saw them, right? So either when they saw the list or when they saw the actual images. And we would expect that so-called auditory learners would be able to recall more words when they heard them, right? But again, the finding is learning is actually the same. The number of words that you recall is exactly the same, regardless of how the material is presented to you. Now, I know that's just one example of one particular study, but I'm asking you to trust me that this has been replicated in many different contexts with many different people of all different ages and tested in slightly different ways with exactly the same results. In fact, there have been several meta-analysis papers where they've looked at all the research on this topic for 40 years, and all of them have concluded the same thing, that there's still no evidence that matching teaching styles to supposed learning styles or students' preferences actually makes a difference. But I would encourage you to look up some of this research on your own, in particular these review articles. So then how is that possible? I'm sure some of you are wondering, how does that even make sense, right? Because it sounds so good. And there's a lot of different research on learning and memory to explain this. But one of the main ideas is that most of what we learn in the classroom, and most of what teachers want us to know in particular, is stored in terms of meaning, and it's not tied to one particular sense or one particular sensory mode. Now, it's also true, just like people have preferences, it's also true that some of you might have better visual memories or better auditory memories or auditory processing skills compared to other people. And that might be advantageous for certain types of tasks. So for example, if I wanted you to remember what was the color of the coat on that last slide, or how many windows were on that house on the last slide, then having a really good visual memory would help with that. Likewise, if I had read you the list of words and I said, were they read in a high voice or a low voice? Or which words were read by a woman and which ones were read by a man? Then having a really good auditory memory would help with that. But those aren't typically the kinds of questions that teachers are asking you to remember or the things that teachers want you to learn in the classroom. Mostly what you're learning in the classroom is much more conceptual or meaning-based, right? It's not just what something looks like or what something sounds like. And by the way, this finding or this whole idea also helps to explain why simple rehearsal strategies like rereading your notes or just rewriting your notes, even though they're very commonly used strategies, they tend to not be very effective because rereading your notes or rewriting your notes doesn't necessarily help you understand the material. In order to retain information, right, we have to organize it in a way that's meaningful, right? We have to make connections to it, connecting it to our experiences or coming up with our own examples or thinking of how we're learning something in one class, how that relates to what else we know. That's what helps us remember it. Now, again, there's a lot of research to support this idea that most of what we learn is stored in terms of meaning and not according to visual images or auditory sounds. But some of the best, most relevant research comes from these classic studies that were done in the 70s. Now, Chase and Simon, they were interested in chess players' abilities to recall pictures of chessboard games in progress. So what they would do is they would show players an image of a game in progress for a short time, typically only 5 seconds or so, and then it would disappear. And then they would ask the players to recall where were all the pictures, where were all the pieces in that picture. And what they found was a big difference between novice players or beginner players and experts. Beginner players, when asked to recall where the pieces were, they could only remember about 4 pieces. All right. Experts, on the other hand, could actually identify almost all of them. Over 20 of them could they correctly identify in the next game board when asked to recall these. Now, again, they were interested in knowing, why is this difference? Why do we see this difference between beginners and novices? And it wasn't because, like you might be thinking, that the experts had better visual memories than the beginners. It was because the experts had more experience playing chess and more knowledge. In other words, this game board was more meaningful to them, right? They could see the strategy involved. They could imagine what was happening and why the players had their pieces positioned the way they did. And to further support this idea, they did a follow-up study. In the follow-up study, they showed chess players pictures of randomly arranged chessboards, right? And that's this picture here. Now, to you or I, or to beginner chess player, these might look basically the same. I mean, yeah, the pieces are in different places, but for the most part, they might be equally difficult to remember, right? To an expert, though, we found big differences when presented with a randomly configured board. Once it was random, experts no longer had an advantage in remembering pieces because it wasn't meaningful to them. But because there's no meaningful arrangement in this second piece, right, they lost that advantage, which again is just further evidence that we store information in terms of meaning and not according to a sensory mode. And this basic finding, by the way, has been extended to other contexts, everything from chess to basketball to computer programming and to dance, right? We store information in terms of meaning and not limited to particular sensory modes. So that's the first reason. Another reason why this learning styles theory doesn't pan out is that, the best way to teach something or to learn something really depends on what it is you want to learn, right? Or depends on the content itself. Now, if I wanted you, for example, to know what a bunch of different songbirds looked like, the best way to teach you that is to let you look at pictures of those songbirds or let you see them in real life, right? But note that that's true for everybody. That's not true just because you're a visual learner, right? That's because looking at them is what I'm asking you to do, is to remember what they look like. On the other hand, if I wanted you to remember what they sounded like or to be able to distinguish between different songs of different songbirds, then letting you hear them would be the best way. But again, that applies to everybody. Just like if I wanted you to know what different flowers smelled like, the best way to teach you that is going to be to let you experience those flowers by smelling them. All right, but that doesn't mean you're an olfactory learner or that you learn everything better through smelling. I mean, take a minute to imagine what that would look like in a math class or in an anatomy class, right, or a physics class, right? And as absurd as that sounds, it's really important to remember that the same problems, the same criticisms apply whether we're talking about so-called olfactory learners or whether we're talking about auditory learners or visual learners or even kinesthetic learners. All right, the last three might seem more palatable or more reasonable, but the same issues apply. It really depends on what I'm asking you to learn, the best way to teach it. But that also brings me to another point, and that's this idea that many things can be taught using multiple senses. So it's not just limited to one, for example. So say I wanted you to learn the game of football, right? Probably the best way to teach you football is going to get you out there and play football, right? To actually practice and having that physical experience playing. But you'd also probably benefit from being able to watch a football game or being able to look at schematics or drawings of the different formations and the different positions, just like you'd probably also benefit from hearing coaching or hearing feedback as you're playing, right? You're getting the kinesthetic experience, the visual, and the auditory. Similarly, if a music teacher wanted you to know the different parts of a symphony orchestra, then yeah, going to an orchestra and listening to one would be beneficial, but it would also add to the experience if you had the capability to touch the instruments, or maybe to learn how to play them, right? Or to actually watch one live. Again, it's not that different modes make it meaningful to different people based on their learning style. It's not like, oh, the visual learners are only going to learn by seeing it, right? It's because incorporating multiple sensory experiences into one into one lesson makes it more meaningful. So then you might be wondering, why does this myth persist, right? And
How can we instruct our learners with different learning modalities or intelligences? Multiple modalities and strategies. Using materials that integrate learner interests, song lyrics, magazines, sports and cultural literature, cookbooks, etc. Connecting the learning to real-world skills. We can also practice skills in a variety of ways: orally, writing, tapping, tracing, and physical movement. As mentioned in Module 1, many of the learners in the Adult Literacy Tutoring Program did not complete school or had difficulty learning in the classroom environment. Learning disabilities may be a factor or consideration for your learner. If we learn that your learner is aware of a learning disability in our intake and assessment, we will relay this information to you. It could also be possible that the learner is unaware of a learning disability. There are many misconceptions about learning disabilities. When you have time, reading through these pages of your tutoring manual and the Adult Literacy Resource Book will be helpful. The main takeaway points are that learning disabilities are processing disorders, and individuals with learning disabilities are of average or above average intelligence. A learning disability cannot be cured or fixed. It is a lifelong challenge. With appropriate support and intervention, people with learning disabilities can achieve success. The best way to deal with a learner who is suspected to have a learning disability is to break things down into manageable steps. Use a multisensory teaching approach. Create meaning that connects to the individual learner. Consistently review or repeat materials or tasks, and teach towards the learner's strengths. The curriculum used by Hawaii Literacy already utilizes many of these strategies. As you get to know your learner, you will discover what works best for them. Remember that no two individuals with learning disabilities are the same, and there's not a one-size-fits-all approach to assisting someone with a learning disability. Though we are not qualified to diagnose learning disabilities, there are many best practices that work to reinforce materials for learners who may have a learning disability. We will discuss these strategies in future modules. If you suspect a learning disability may be a factor for your learner after you begin working and the curriculum or strategies that we discuss in future modules do not seem to be working, or progress is slow after many sessions, please reach out to the Hawaii Literacy staff. We can provide support, extra resources, or other interventions. This ends Module 2. Please take the corresponding quiz and note any questions that you may have.